Thank you and good evening, everyone, to the Williamsport City Council meeting. It's Thursday, October 21st, 2021. It's 7 p.m. and we are meeting remotely tonight again. We're going to first need to announce we had an executive session, excuse me, Monday evening to discuss legal issues regarding a lease agreement and contract purchases. We'll go to item number 1 then, approval of city council minutes dated 10/7/21. Is there a motion and a second from council?
So moved. Second.
Council, any questions or corrections tonight to the minutes? Hearing or seeing none, Mrs. Frank on the motion, please.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi, Mr. Pelisi,
Vince, are you muted?
Selena took over again.
No, there he is.
Mr. Pelisi on the minutes.
He's connecting right now.
Shall I wait?
Now he's muted.
I apologize about that. It kept booting me off. But yes.
Mrs. Katz,
Yes.
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Ms. Mealy,
I believe she's absent tonight. I was going to announce that in a second.
okay, and Mr. Allison.
Yes. Motion passes 6-0. She may be able to chime in at some point, but I'm not counting on that. And the members of the Finance Committee are already aware of that. We'll move to item 2, limited courtesy of the floor. We've had no requests tonight. We're going to move to the next item, but we're moving item 16 up to the top. And would you read that in short form, please, Mrs. Frank?
Resolution acceptance of the 30 June 2020 Williamsport Bureau of Transportation Annual Audit.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Is there a motion and a second from council tonight?
So moved.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. So we welcome tonight. Okay, this is under Mr. Winder. And we welcome the auditors tonight from RKL. Mr. Winder, do you want to open this up and introduce the auditors tonight?
Sure. This is the June 30th, 2019 to July 1st, 2019 to June 30th, 2020 audit for River Valley Transit. This was reviewed in finance. We do have Mark Zedemoyer with RKL. I'm looking to see if we have Tim Kraft.
I saw that. I saw him somewhere.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, yep, there you are. I'm sorry, a lot of faces up here tonight. They will be presenting this to council tonight for your approval. It was forwarded with a positive recommendation from the Finance Committee, so I will turn it over to Mr. Kraft or Mr. Zedemoyer.
Thank you, Mr. Winder.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Sotomayor. I'll go through the highlights of the financial statement. If members of council have questions as we go through the financials, please let us know. With me tonight is Tim Kraft. He was the engagement partner / manager out in the field during the field work. Again, this is for the year ended June 30, 2020. Now, what is up on your screen is the cover page of the financial statements. We'll jump right into the independent.
Real quick, two quick questions before we really dive into this that I didn't think of or got thrown off a little off guard on Tuesday to ask. So the resolution has a discrepancy compared to the recommendation in the audit. The resolution says an unqualified report, and this is a adverse opinion. Do we need to fix that? Does anybody know where that came from, Adam Winder?
Yeah, that was the recommendation of Solicitor Nagy to use that terminology on the resolution itself.
Do we know why it's different than what the opinion of the audit was?
I would think it was just an error on Jill's when she communicated it. She
Okay,
was aware of the type of opinion that was going to be presented.
okay. I just noticed this one again. So the audit that we have is in draft format. This one also is in draft format. And the date here conflicts with what we have. Why is this still in draft format?
Because in order to issue finals, it should be approved by council first. So once council approves the draft, then we will issue it in final as
Okay.
of today's date, which is the date that council approved it.
Okay.
I-
That's
Why
the
is that?
normal.
That seems a little backwards.
Well,
No, that's the professional standards that, as we go through it, you'll see that the
Okay.
financial statements are the responsibility of council and management. So we are there to assist in
Okay.
the preparation of the draft financial statements. So once you see them, you approve them. And then once you approve them, we can issue them in final form that you agree that this is the version of the financial statement.
Okay.
I might,
And that's the normal practice.
we had requests for the audit to be released to the press on Tuesday after the finance meeting, and I advised our city clerk that we couldn't do that until it was voted on because it wasn't officially accepted or official document.
That's right. It's not an official document until it's accepted and issued in final form.
Okay. I sorry to interrupt you. I appreciate the clarification on that. I thought they were pretty foundational stuff before really diving into this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. So we'll start with independent auditors report on page 1. And some of this we just talked a little bit. Of course, the financial statements in the first paragraph indicate it's for the year ended June 30, 2020. And what we just touched on was management's responsibility for the financial statement. So while we assist in drafting the financial statements, the city council and management has the responsibility for the presentation of the financial statements in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, and also for the underlying design and internal controls, the implementation of that internal control structure, and the maintenance of that internal control structure. And as part of that, drafts are presented to council as part of that process and that control structure and process. Our responsibility as independent auditors is to test the underlying documentation under the financial statements, look at the internal control structure, see if we see any areas within it that are not functioning properly, or that we think there's room for improvements of it. We look at supporting documentation and test the transactions that are underlying the numbers in the financial statement. And then we give our opinion, which is on the top of page 2. And as Adam had mentioned, it is an adverse opinion. And basically what that means is during our testing of the financial statements, excuse me, and the related transactions, we couldn't get to a position where we felt the financial statements are free from material misstatement. And we'll go through those examples or some items that relate to that, and that towards the end of this discussion, we'll look at some findings and reportable conditions that we have at the back of the audit. So in our opinion, because of the significance of those financial statements, we don't believe they fairly present the financial position of the Bureau at June 30, 2020. And then there's some other information in your financial statements that's required to be included in that. One of those is a management's discussion and analysis. Because of the nature of the report this year, there isn't a management's discussion and analysis. It doesn't impact really the opinion at all. It should be in there, and it had been in prior years, but and going forward, hopefully that will be included in it. So if we can jump down to page 4, which is the statement of net position. And the statement of net position is really very similar to a balance sheet if you're more familiar from a corporate environment. So at June 30th, cash was $2.1 million, almost $2.2 million in the Bureau. Now, of that cash, the bulk of that cash, actually all of that cash, is restricted under various grant agreements that the authority or the Bureau has. The Bureau also had some grant receivables of about $2.7 million. Those relate to transit operating type of grants. There was also some funds that were due from the city related to debt service payments that the authority had advanced. And then the largest item on the balance sheet from an asset standpoint is the capital assets. Those net of depreciation totaled almost $55 million. So some of these items in here are areas that present a challenge. When we look at the capital assets, the Bureau has a lot of assets on the books that are not necessarily transit related. They're projects that were done related to city projects or city owned projects and investments. That impacts a lot of different things on the financial statement, from grants receivables, unearned revenue, those type of things, and what the presentation of the proper amount of assets is. There's also some things on here called deferred outflows of resources. When we jump to the next page, you'll also see some deferred inflow of resources too. Those relate to the pension plans or employee benefit plans. Again, there's some challenges related to that because there's not necessarily time studies to allocate labor properly and salary properly along those lines. So there was a crossover in a lot of instances between activities related to the Bureau and activities related to the city. And the Bureau's component of it is funded by primarily through transit grants from PennDOT and also through the FTA. So you can't use a PennDOT grant or an FTA grant to fund or pay costs related to the city or any other organizations. So when we look on the next section of the balance sheet, that's the liability side of it. We had total current liabilities on the books of about $6,500,000, almost $6.6 million. You'll see a couple of items in there. Payables due to the city of Williamsport, $1 million. The actual details and the components of that are difficult to come up and determine what those are. There's amounts due to other governments. Unearned Commonwealth of Pennsylvania Act 44 funds. Those are funds that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania provided to the Bureau, and they give them to them in advance, usually through 11 or 12 monthly payments. And then those funds are to be utilized for the provision of public transportation in the area that's covered by River Valley Transit. In looking at the expenses charged to those or charged against those grants, we did see some expenditures that were related to other entities. There were some expenses related to the parking authority that were run through the Bureau. There were transactions related to some other organizations as well that were run for the Bureau. So It appears that some of those grant funds that were to be used for public transportation were used for things other than the provision of those public transportation services. When we drop down to the long-term liability section, there's about $12 million of debt that the authority or the Bureau has on its books. 10 to $12 million. In looking at the debt agreements, a lot of that debt it seems to be related to projects that were more in the nature of the city. And one of the things that we did see was that some of the Act 44 funds, the grant funds that PennDOT provides to the Bureau, were being utilized to pay the debt service on those long-term obligations. Now, under the Act 44 grant agreements, debt service payments is not an eligible expense, and if you would use Act 44 money for the acquisition of any capital assets, you would have to have pre-approval for that transaction before those transactions occurred. If we could jump down to the income statement. You'll see the operating revenues and expenses. Your operating revenues were about $1.8 million. Operating expenses were about $14 million. Within that operating expense category, there's about $3.8 million of depreciation. That's a non-cash expense. So if you subtract that out, your cash-related expenditures were about $10 million. Within, I'll jump back up to the revenues in a second, but within the expenses, as I mentioned, we did see some expenses that were for entities other than the Bureau and for transactions other than the provision of public transportation services. So that really impacts the amount of unearned revenue that is related to the Act 44 grants and makes it impossible to determine what that is. I believe ultimately there'll have to be some agreement with PennDOT on as to what the unearned or deferred portion of the Act 44 funds will be per the agreement. Your passenger fares, I'm going to jump back up to the top. Your passenger fares were about $636,000 industry-wide across the country. Everybody knows passenger fares were down. The Endless Mountain Transportation Service contract, that's shared ride services that you provide for Endless Mountain. As we were testing that particular line item, one of the things we saw was an adjustment into that account where Endless Mountain Transit Authority was requested to write checks on behalf of River Valley out of the Endless Mountain bank account for the purchase of 3 used vehicles. And they totaled somewhere around approximately $60,000. So what RBT should have done, or the Bureau should have done, has gone to PennDOT, gotten approval to purchase transportation vehicles, gotten capital grants for that, and gone through that process. What RBT did was have the Endless Mountain write those checks for it, and then they gave Endless Mountain a credit against its transportation bill. So if Endless Mountain for a particular month owed, for example, $50,000 for transit fees, they were given a credit against that bill as kind of a reimbursement to fund the acquisition of those shared ride vehicles. So not going through the appropriate and the grant funded and approved process related to that. If we drop down into your non-operating revenues and expenses, your federal government grants, $2,474,000. Commonwealth of Pennsylvania Act 44 funds that expenses were applied against it was $4.5 million, and then local government funds were about $535,000. One of the things that you'll see in the findings in the back of the report relates to local funding. Under your Act 44 grant agreements, and I'll use an example of $4 million, PennDOT may say to the Bureau, we'll give you $4 million to fund your operations for fiscal 1920. But as part of that, we want you to have a local match to our $4 million of $400,000. What we noted during the audit process related to that local match component is that the city would write a check or fund the Bureau for that local match component of it, that $400,000. But then the Bureau would in turn indicate that it was going to go out to local municipalities, the boroughs and townships that you serve, and collect funds from them to assist with that local match. And the Bureau would write a check back to the city for that amount. So if the city wrote an initial check, for example, for $400,000, the Bureau might indicate that they were going to collect $100,000 from neighboring municipalities or service municipalities, write a check back to the city for that $100,000, but then not go out and collect those funds or collect all of those funds from the municipality. So in effect, when PennDOT gave you that grant and said you need to put in $400,000 of local funds, between the transactions where the city wrote the check and the Bureau wrote it back to the city, you didn't contribute. The Bureau didn't get the contributions for the total local match that they were supposed to. So it understated the local match and the collections related to that. Another item that's on here is interest expense. Excuse me? Oh, okay. Did someone have a question?
That was Norm. He's not muted.
Oh, okay. The other item that's on here is interest expense of $536,000, almost $537,000. That relates to the debt service that we paid, or that we talked about a little bit earlier. If we could turn to the statement of cash flows. This is another way of looking at your statement of revenue, expenses, and changes in that position or your
Mark?
Yes.
This is Bonnie Katz. I do have a question. To go back, I didn't realize I was muted. Go back to the match on the collections.
Okay.
Who was responsible to go after the matches? The city or RVT at that point?
It would be, I would say RVT, because RVT was indicating that they would collect those funds to match the PennDOT grant. That's my understanding.
So RVT hasn't been collecting the matches for a while then?
Not the full local matches, correct. A part of it was collected from the city, and there was some smaller amounts collected from some municipalities. The other thing that we saw related to local match is the RVT was including some things as local match that really don't qualify as a local match. So local match is really supposed to be a non-exchange transaction. Give me $10,000 to help fund transportation. And basically, there's no particular commitment or promise back in place. What we did see happening is that there was some trip services revenue that was being counted as local match. So if you would have an agreement with an employer or an organization to provide transit service to their door or as part of the route, and they would contribute money to the Bureau, that in some instances was being treated as local match. And that's not local match, that's transportation revenue or passenger fares.
So what you're saying is if they used it, say for special events, and used the buses to transport people to the special events, that cannot be used as a match.
That's correct. That would
Okay.
be passenger revenue.
Okay,
And in the past, the amount of passenger revenue that was run to the local share exceeded the shortfall in the local share that was collected. So it appeared on the surface like they were getting the full local share in, which is why this didn't appear in the past as an issue or a finding.
okay. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Sure. On the cash flow statement, then two, I do want to point out one of the items in here, the Act 44 funds. Your RBT is supposed to be doing public transportation. That's its primary focus. So the PennDOT grants and the federal grants aren't approved for the payment of debt service. So you can see in the middle of the page here, we had payments on the line of credit of about $650,000 and payments on long-term debt about $395,000. Now, the line of credit, if those funds were drawn on the line of credit for transit purposes, paying for supplies or fuel or parts or inventory, that would be permissible. But if the amounts that are drawn on the line of credit or related to long-term debt relate to things other than transportation or providing transportation activities, then that's not an eligible expense for the grant funding. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit in the financial statements to the footnotes. The footnotes, and I'm going to touch briefly on some of it. The footnotes start on page 10 of the financial statement. And note the first 3 or 4 notes really talk about the accounting principles that are related to the Bureau, what the Bureau does, the budget responsibilities or requirements related to budgets, those type of things. In note 4, we talk about the adverse opinion. It's a reiteration of a lot of things that we've already talked about. And if we have more questions, either through the meeting or offline, certainly feel free to ask us. Note 5, restricted cash. Again, those are funds that were received in grant-related type of funds, and they're restricted for grant-related type of purposes. One of the things that's important, not only with the Bureau's cash, but also with the city's cash, is that those funds are either FDIC insured or collateralized, and those are on behalf of the Bureau. The grants receivable, we talked about a little bit. There's $2,740,000. The grants receivable through related parties, the $2,256,000. Tim, do you recall more of the details on that one, who those are from?
Yeah, the largest piece of that is actually due from the city itself, related to capital activity that passed through the Bureau. And that is the majority of what is sitting in there. There is a piece that was about $400,000 that related to the LDEC, and that was subsequently collected after the end of the year.
Note 7 is the capital assets. It's really just a roll forward of the beginning capital assets, fixed asset additions to that, deletions related to that, and then the balance. Now, when you look at those, one of the things that was noted during the audit process, that in capital assets for this year, there were a lot of assets that were being acquired through RBT that were city-related assets and being put on the books of the Bureau when they were city-funded assets. That those were taken out of the Bureau should be put over to the city. The funds that were expended are a component of a receivable from the city as well. Note 10 is on page 17. This is your unearned Act 44 money. So the funds that PennDOT has given you to run the transit system operations for which you have not charged expenses against them at this point in time. It's important to understand the grant agreements, and it's very important to make sure that the expenses that are being applied or to those grant funds are permissible under PennDOT's guidelines. And PennDOT issued some audit guidelines and grant guidelines, I believe in the 2015 timeframe. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tim. So those requirements are out there. They're published. They're on PennDOT's website, and it specifies specific audit requirements that are supposed to be done related to those grants. The long-term debt that's on the books of the Bureau, this is the debt maturity schedule for those. Again, we're not comfortable that all of this debt is truly Bureau debt that's out there, but based on the current agreements in place, the Bureau had at June 30th committed to these debt service payments of $769,000, et cetera. Now, your operations of the transit system are funded through federal, state, and local operating grants. Those grants don't permit the debt service, doesn't permit for the payment of debt service. So in order for the Bureau to pay this type of debt, it would need contributions or funding from another source, primarily the city, to make those payments. And some of this debt is due over to third-party entities. So Williamsport Parking Authority, there's an intermunicipal debt agreement. I believe it was originally in the $1.5 or $2 million range. Again, can't use PennDOT money or FTA money to pay those debt service payments. Note 14 is risk management. That relates to your insurance pools for safety. One of the things that we did mention earlier this week on the Finance Committee call, I believe Safety is looking at a program related to a hotline, for a fraud hotline for individuals to call in, express concerns anonymously. If Safety does do something along those lines, I would strongly recommend that the city and the Bureau look into participating in that. If Safety wouldn't do that, I would suggest you explore that avenue anyway, in either regard, to see if it's something that is a fit for the city. One thing I did make clear, that your audit firm is not permitted to service that or be part of that fraud hotline. That would be an independence issue. Your auditor would be considered part of your internal control process and therefore not be independent. So it would need to be somebody that is apart from us as auditors of the Bureau, and whoever your auditors are for the city could not participate in monitoring that. We do have some findings that I want to talk about. I won't go into the pension plan because this is just a slide off of RVT's portion of it, and we're not quite comfortable with the allocation of that. But if we can jump down to the findings, I'll touch on the ones that we haven't already talked about. So page 50 starts the compliance audit component of the annual audit process. And your records are required to be audited in accordance with governmental auditing standards. As part of that, we test the compliance with certain rules and regulations. We look at compliance with grant agreements as part of that. We look at your internal control structure. And then in looking at those systems and testing of those transactions, if we see something of concern, then we report it to the auditee in what's referred to as a schedule of findings and responses. I believe we have 5 items that we were reporting here. And one of the largest ones, or the most prolific one, was really the management's ability to override controls. So you have a system of internal controls in place. Those systems are managed and controlled, obviously, by management. So what we noted in here is a lot of transactions, or a number of transactions, appear to be outside of the appropriate approval process or compliance with grant agreements. And there was no system in place that was there to catch them, or if it was, that system was overridden. And through the process of talking with some individuals, they had expressed some concern about those systems and those systems being overridden. If you had something like a fraud hotline or some type of reporting line for employees and other individuals, that would be a good compensating control that would help reduce exposure here. So if somebody sees somebody that's doing something that they feel is not in compliance with whatever policies, procedures, regulations, grant agreements is in place, they would have a mechanism to report that so that council or its designated group could look at it. Could be your law firm, it could be some outside third party could look at it. The finding on page 53, we talked about that improper payment of bureau expenses. We did see payments going through the records of the bureau that were for third-party entities, that they were not bureau or direct city related expenses. The items that are run through the bureau should be for the bureau activities and public transportation. If we flip to finding number 3, this is the one that we talked about related to the out of service area trips, where Endless Mountain wrote a check on behalf of RVT for the purchase of 3 vehicles, and then RVT gave Endless Mountain a credit against its monthly bills for the trips that RVT provided to them. It went around the process of going through the approval process, going through PennDOT, getting PennDOT's approval, getting the proper grants in place. So it circumvented the established processes that are there. Operating fund, improper use of operating funds. We talked about debt service. Act 44, there's no provision to pay debt service payments related to that. We did look at the principal and interest payments when we went through the income statement and the cash flow statement. So we did see operating funds being used for debt service payments. That is not in accordance with the grant agreements. And then we also talked about the last finding on page 56, which was the local operating match, where the local operating match was not properly collected from either the city, when looking at the net amount, the amount the city wrote a check for, and the net reimbursement it received. So if you look at what was collected from the city and the serviced municipalities, it did not meet the requirements for the local match. One of the other things that was noted during the audit process was that the other municipalities there were bills generated for those other municipalities, but those bills were not always sent out. And one of the things that we noted during the audit process this year, there was some amount in the receivables as of July 1st of 2019 for local match from neighboring municipalities or service municipalities. But during the year, those receivables were never collected and were ultimately written off the books. So it wasn't an instance that is isolated to 2020. It appears to be an instance or circumstance that has preceded 2020. That's a pretty detailed overview of the financial statements. Does anybody have any specific questions for either Tim or myself?
Let's let me go to finance, the finance committee. And we need to note that I think almost all the council was listening in one form or another during the finance committee meeting on this. So there may be questions from everybody, but I'm going to go to Bonnie Katz first, so second in command at finance, and Adam
Okay.
Shepherd.
Thank you, Randy. When we see the bottom line on the very last page where it says, this represents a shortfall of 11.222 million. This,
No, that's 11,000.
11,000. I'm sorry, I misread that. Gotta get my glasses on here.
Okay. Yeah, we don't want that in the meeting.
No, we don't want that to happen.
We just all felt a shockwave, Bonnie.
Seriously, I know, in my own mind, I didn't mean to say it that way. These are all, when we look at this audit, some of the expenses that have been done have been transferred over to city properties. And this is what you've been saying. It has been misappropriated as far as using the funds that you cannot use transportation funds to finance some of the projects that were done in the city. And this has been going on for a couple of years at this point. Am I correct in stating this?
From what we've seen, it appears that these transactions did not just begin to occur in 2020. So yeah, I believe that it has occurred in prior years, that you've used PennDOT Act 44 funds for things other than the grant related purposes.
So therefore, anything that was done with the city with transportation funds is then going to be the responsibility of the city to fund back to the RVT for this?
Well, that's one of the things that I think it's important for the city to do is be in contact with PennDOT. And PennDOT obviously knows that there's issues or concerns here. And at some point, there will have to be a meeting of the minds between the city and PennDOT on what the appropriate amount of deferred or unused Act 44 funds should be. So if it comes back that there's a shortfall, that the city owes funds back to the Bureau, yeah, ultimately would have to come from the city, or there would be, sometimes I've seen PennDOT do a reduction in the annual allocation to a transit system as a way of reimbursing back to PennDOT for that. So if you would normally get, we've talked about $4 million. If you would normally get $4 million as an operating grant from PennDOT, they may reduce that on an annual basis until they recoup that amount that was spent on things other than grant purpose funds. But that would all.
I don't know if you can answer this question. This all has to do with Act 44 and PennDOT. And we have never seen audits, okay? This has been a newbie for all of us to have seen these figures and anything related to RVT like this.
Okay.
But we were always under the assumption that PennDOT was always going in and doing their own audits. Would they not have caught the fact that these grants and fundings from there were going towards city projects? I don't know if you can answer that or not.
Yeah, PennDOT doesn't do audits of its transit systems that it funds. The transits under the requirements of the grant agreements and the audit guide are responsible to go out and hire an independent audit. They prescribe the procedures that are to be performed by the independent auditor and prescribe the format of the I don't want to say prescribe the format, but they have guidelines as to how the financial statement should be presented. But PennDOT in and of itself does not go out and do audits.
See, we were led to,
One thing you might be thinking of is called a triennial review. So every 3 years, in association with the Act 44 funding, PennDOT will go out and do a triennial review on the authority. So they will look at policies, procedures, performance measures, and things like that. But it's not as granular looking at specific transactions and details as the financial statement audit is that we perform.
Yeah, they
I
wouldn't.
just,
Go ahead.
I wanted to clarify this because so many of us, including citizens in the city, have heard this over the years. And so I just wanted to clarify this for us and for the public of how this was done, because I think we're all trying to figure out how this all happened to get to this state at this point.
Mhm. Yeah, PennDOT does not come out and do audits, and it comes out. PennDOT also comes out every 5 years and does an Act 44 review. But as Tim said, part of that is looking at specific ratios and performance measures. It's not a detailed testing of, well, show me this invoice for this purchase or this expenditure. So what PennDOT does is completely different from an independent audit or a financial audit.
Gotcha. Just wanted to clarify that. I'll defer now to Adam.
Yeah, and just to kind of, I guess, maybe sum up the discussion after the presentation in finance, because that question is a really good segue. A lot of the discussion was really about things that we could do to ensure that we continue to get in compliance and stay in compliance. And, you know, realistically, there were two foundational things that really, I think, enabled this kind of thing to happen. One is inadequate checks and balances that have been out of whack for years, and council, you know, has made really good strides to address that already with last year's work. And the other one, which was discussed, and I think all of finance and the administration is in agreement, city council needs to have more formal and adequate oversight. We need a formal oversight committee. And I know I've been barking up that tree for a number of months. You know, this validates that. And frankly, the Act 44 performance review validates that as well. I actually submitted legislation tonight for next week's agenda to hopefully we can start that and get that addressed. And I hope council will support that. You know, the administration's really made a lot of strides to correct these issues, which is great. I think we all applaud that. We need to make sure that we stay compliant. At one point we got out of whack, you know, and I think this will do that. Another general, just I think, comment that since Tuesday's meeting that I've been thinking through, and this is for all of us, this is for council, the mayor, the administration, everybody in city government. You know, this is a really important issue. This is a monumental thing that we're figuring out and tackling. But there's a lot of other monumental issues that we're facing as well. And, you know, it's great that we're figuring this out, but this can't be the only thing we figure out and work through. We need to make sure that we're still figuring out the other large issues. and making sure that they're not falling by the wayside, because if they do, the other overarching problems that this is going to make worse are going to continue to get worse. And we've got tools at our disposal to properly govern and to combat these while we figure this out. We have to keep our eye on the ball and make sure that we don't fall behind in other areas while we continue to address this. So I'm confident we will, but I wanted to raise that point because it's really easy for that to happen. And it would be a really big shame for that to happen. Our constituents and the future of the city really demand that doesn't happen. So that was the gist of the conversation, though, in finance. A lot of my questions have been answered, at least individually. So I'll yield the floor to other members of council. So thanks.
Other questions? I had a couple. The overstated assets that you mentioned up in the we'll say the balance sheet section. What purpose or effect would that accomplish? I'm looking for the motivation to do that.
Well, I'm just surmising, but those assets on there that are capital related, a lot of those were funded with debt.
Mm-hmm.
By putting the capital asset on the books, you also put the debt on the books of the Bureau, but then appears you utilize the Act 44 funds to pay the debt service on those assets.
Okay.
Utilizing those Act 44 funds to pay the debt service is not in compliance with the debt or with the grant agreements.
That makes total sense. Thank you. The other question I had was the non-collection of local match from other entities. Depending on the amount of years that went on, if we're going back on all things financial that weren't done right, is there a rationale to go back on those?
Well, maybe somebody from the RVT side or the Bureau side can add to this and correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not 100% sure those municipalities that were billed ever knew they were being billed. So
Okay.
some of the bills were being held and never sent out. And can somebody add some clarification to that if that's incorrect?
That's 100% correct. And I'll use Jersey Shore for the example. We talked to Mr. Hoover in Jersey Shore because we did send him an invoice for his portion of the local share. He called right away and said he was unaware that they were ever supposed to pay it. They didn't budget it. You know, they just had no idea that it was theirs. So we're working collectively with all the municipalities to, give them notification, figure out exactly what their local share should be, because we're not even sure that the numbers that were written down are the correct numbers based upon PennDOT's calculations of how you come up with the local share. I can't even tell you the city's local share is actually correct.
Well, I think all council knows that we did vote on that every year. So there is a record of that.
Right. The overall amount is correct based upon PennDOT. It's just the way you're supposed to calculate each municipality's share based upon ridership miles, hours of service. We just want to make sure we're doing everything correctly moving forward and working with the municipalities to understand what their local share is, why they're contributing, et cetera, because there's a lot of them that have not paid or even knew that they were supposed to pay.
Okay, well, that's a reasonable explanation there. So my last question then is kind of a general question related, not just to this particular audit, because throughout we've heard there were things that you could identify as you were not comfortable with how the numbers were arrived at. And obviously we've heard different things that were done over the years that way. And this is out of the purview of RKL, because you were looking at one fiscal year there of RBT, but it seemed like it will be a monumental task to have these things unraveled in a sense where we can have confidence that in figures that we may owe or someone else may owe is perhaps the administration can speak to that. What mechanism is there in place that might be doing that, or has it already done?
Sure. So as Mr. Zettelmoyer said, working with PennDOT and the FTA. So, and I apologize to Deputy Secretary. I forget her married name off the top of my head. Lou Worst, I believe. But Deputy Secretary, her maiden name was Granger. Deputy Secretary Granger. We've been working with her pretty much every single week, as council is aware, for the last, 2 years almost, well over a year and a half. We've also been in contact with the FTA. And so there's still, as Mr. Zettelmoyer noted, there's still some work to be done, both with the administration, council, PennDOT, and FTA, to try and determine what that amount is, and then the mechanism in which we're going to, if we owe PennDOT and FTA money back, which clearly it sounds like we probably will, the mechanism to repay them. So we are working through that right now. Mm-hmm. Clearly, we haven't come to a determination of a figure or the way in which that will be repaid. I just spoke to Deputy Secretary earlier this week, and again, she's planning, I believe, to come up here again. I believe in early November, in a few weeks here. So nonetheless, we'll be working, we have been, and we will continue to work closely with her, and obviously keep City Council abreast. We'll continue to work with, RKL as they finalize this here, and then moving forward to make sure that everything is accounted. But yeah, the big question is, what do we owe back and how are we going to repay that? So we just have to continue to work with PennDOT and FTA, and as soon as we have a number and a way, then that's obviously going to have to be discussed.
Yeah, and I do agree with that. We need that number, but I think there's some other numbers that we need from the other direction. What services were of the city side were being used to underwrite things. I think there's it's a complicated, I'm not going to say scheme, but it was a complicated operation with a lot of moving parts, and evidently a fair number of those parts were not done according to legal requirements. So I think there's a little bit of a flow back and forth, obviously not to the quid pro quo the same, but we'd be interested in the city's, whatever transpired there.
Right. So we're working through that. Council approved I forget the name, Zelenovsky, I'm not sure, and Axelrod.
Mhm.
And so they're working on our 2019 and 2020 audit. So that will help on the city side. They're working on the city audit. And so as they work through that, clearly, I think that will show what you're saying, Council President Allison, on the city side, some of that flow and money between the city and RVT, and what amount the city, per se, might be responsible for as related to what did RVT do on its own, unrelated to the city, and then what amount of debt or money falls squarely on the city to repay. Did we receive transit funds that we should not have received for any type of city projects, et cetera? And what was that amount? And again, working with ZNA and PennDOT and FTA. So we have started that process. Obviously, I don't have a number at this point, but hopefully in the not too distant future we will. But you're correct. There most likely will be some money that falls squarely on the city, and then there'll be money that is only RVT, and then maybe a little bit of both in some instances.
Or services that we provided to RVT that the city didn't get reimbursed for. Okay, thank you. Those are all the questions I have right now. Anyone else from council? All right, well, thank you, Mark, and it's
All right, thank you. If you have any questions at any point, please feel free to reach out to either Tim or myself.
oh, there's Tim. I lost you for a minute, Tim. Thank both of you so much, and thank the administration for what you're doing, and thank council. We were all engaged in this initial report on Tuesday, and as befits its importance, everybody got an initial briefing there. So, gentlemen, we again thank you, and for the rest of us, this is a story that is to be continued.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Well. Okay, well, we got the easy one out of the way, so just kidding. Let's move on to item 3 now.
Randy, we have to vote on this.
Oh, yes, we do. I'm sorry. We do have a motion in a second. Mrs. Frank on the motion, please.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
Yes,
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes 6-0. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Item 3. Would you read that in short form, please, Mrs. Frank?
Resolution setting city council meetings for the year 2022.
Is there a motion and a second from council?
So move.
second.
Motion and a second. Thank you. There were a couple things I mentioned to briefly to other council members. And one was in a conversation that I had with Mr. Lubin. So our initial meeting of the year is scheduled for Thursday, January 6th, which is a Thursday, but since it follows a municipal election, we have to have it on a Monday. So we'll need an amendment on that. And if we go down to the November section, we have a regular council meeting on the 10th. And then the next meeting we skip the next Thursday because it's Thanksgiving. Then we move down to Monday, the 28th, to start our budget discussions. Generally, we do have a meeting before that so that we can get the budget and discuss it a little bit. But to do that, we'd have to schedule a Tuesday, the 22nd meeting. And I spoke to Mr. Pavlak earlier, and Mr. Pavlak, could you jump in on this for a moment?
I guess my thoughts are, and the solicitor can correct me if I'm not correct in the way of my thinking. I guess there's two options. We could, if we are not able for the 10th to have the budget completed and are still working through it, we could schedule a special meeting to deliver the budget to council. Or if council would like, we can schedule that meeting on the 22nd, just in case. And if we can have it done by the 10th, delivered on the 10th, and cancel the meeting on the 22nd if there's no other business to discuss. So I guess those are the options that I thought of based on your discussions with you.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Pavlak. Mr. Lubin, do you have anything to add on that? Does that sound reasonable?
Okay, I would recommend at least scheduling for the 22nd now. That way, if anyone has plans to make, they at least know there's a potential for a council meeting.
Right. And does that?
Because you could always cancel. You could always cancel it. I think
Yes.
it's easier to schedule
Yes.
it now as opposed to
We don't want to-
rescheduling it then.
Save
Exactly.
us from additional advertising.
Yes. And I think probably all council feels that way, I would imagine. Mr. Lubin, could we do one motion to amend both of those?
Yes.
Okay, could I have a motion and a second to change January 6th?
Yeah, I'll make a motion. Well, hang on. Are we still having the full meeting on January 6th also? We're not eliminating that, correct?
That would depend. Yeah, that would depend on whether the administration would need one in the beginning of the year, but we could do business right then. So
Okay.
I would suggest,
Just leave it
could we
alone.
not do business on the reorganizational meeting, Mr. Lubin?
Generally, it's not done.
Okay,
I would leave the Thursday meeting on also. If there's for some reason there's no need for it, we can always cancel it.
right.
Okay.
Okay, then we'll add the 3rd.
Yep.
Keep the 6th and add the 22nd of November. That's it.
Yeah. So I'll make a motion to amend the resolution to add Monday, January 3rd, 2022 as our reorganizational meeting, and Tuesday, November 22nd, 2022 be listed in chronological order in line with the rest of the dates.
I'll second the motion.
Motion and a second to make those changes. Any other discussion from council? Hearing and seeing none on the motion. Mrs. Frank, please.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
Yes,
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes 6-0. Okay, we'll go back to the original motion then to accept the calendar that's now been amended. And is there any more discussion on that? Okay, there are no more changes. So on the original motion, please, Mrs. Frank.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
yes,
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Ms. Mealy, Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes 6-0. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Okay, we'll move down to item 4. Would you read that in short form, please, Mrs. Frank?
Resolution approving an administrative services agreement and an investment advisory and management services agreement with Empower Retirement.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Is there a motion and second, council?
So move.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Mr. Pavlik.
Good evening, everyone. This is a resolution to approve an administrative services agreement with Empower Retirement. Earlier this year, or the end of last year, I believe, Empower Retirement bought out the Mass Mutual Retirement Services. So this is the resolution that they're requiring us, and the agreement that they're requiring us to sign in order to transfer over the administrative services to Empower Retirement. This is for the city's 457 plan. It's a deferred compensation plan that we offer to individuals or employees that wish to participate. This was reviewed by the solicitor's office and also reviewed by the individuals at Wells Fargo who assist plan members with investment choices if they choose. One thing that I did notice and that I did forget to change, I did bring it up in finance, but I think that the resolution needs amended to remove the investment advisory and management services from the title. And this was brought to council with a positive recommendation from the Finance Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Pavlik. Mrs. Katz.
Yes, this was brought to finance. Nothing has really changed in the contract cost-wise or anything else. And I think Joe has answered all the questions except to make an amendment on the resolution title itself. Norm, do we have to make does that have to be done?
Yes.
Okay.
Are
Joe,
you-
what was the language change and where was it? Remind me.
It's just to remove the words and investment advisory and management services agreement. The title should read resolution approving an administrative services agreement with Empower Retirement.
Okay. I'll make a motion to modify the title to read resolution approving an administrative services agreement with Empower Retirement.
Second.
Second the motion.
Okay, there's a motion and a second. Is there other discussion? Did you get that wording, Mrs. Frank?
I did, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Okay, well then, no other questions or anything. We'll have the vote, please.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
Yes.
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Motion to amend the title of the resolution passes 6-0. And now we'll go back to the original motion to pass the resolution as amended. Would you call the vote on that, please, Mrs. Frank?
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
Yes.
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes 6-0. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Thank you, Mr. Pavlik.
Thank you.
Let's move down to Mr. To the mayor, item 5. Would you read that in short form, please, Mrs. Frank?
Resolution authorizing execution of agreement between City of Williamsport, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Department of Transportation, UPMC Williamsport, Little League Baseball, and Pennsylvania College of Technology.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Is there a motion and a second?
So move.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Mayor Slaughter?
Yes, good evening, President Allison, members of council and administration. What you have before you is a resolution authorizing execution of agreement between the city, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, PennDOT, UPMC, and Little League Baseball Incorporated, and Pennsylvania College of Technology. whereas the applicant, which in this case is UPMC, Little League, Penn College, and the city want to enter and use the state highway right-of-way for directional signage. And what this allows then is it permits the above parties to complete that project. And as far as the city, we do not have any cost involved with this agreement and this signage upgrades. Basically what this is on the Beltway, along the Beltway, UPMC is applying to have a few of the signs upgraded upgraded, changed with just upgraded language as far as the hospital now that's UPMC, no longer Williamsport Hospital, things of that nature. And so that's what this agreement permits. This was reviewed and financed. There was a slight change. I sent out the city council for Exhibit A. The hospital UPMC just made a slight change with regards to the word hospital. And Norm Lubin did review that and said that was fine. So council does have an updated Exhibit A. It does not change anything related to the agreement, though. This was reviewed in finance and reviewed by our solicitor, Norm Lubin.
Thank you, Mayor Slaughter. This was reviewed in finance.
Yes, it was. I think first Dan Hoffman, you're representing UPMC tonight.
Yes.
Yes, he is. Sorry about that. I should have said. Sorry.
Just wanted to acknowledge his presence here tonight. One of the things that went with this, yes, it was passed with a positive recommendation, first of all. And a couple of things here. 2 of the signs are being removed that say Divine Providence at this point, because now it is strictly all UPMC. Am I stating that correctly, Mr. Hoffman?
Well, it's really no longer licensed as a hospital because it does not have any emergency. It's a department of UPMC Williamsport now.
And the other signages that are going up really are to clarify different areas at this point. You're cleaning up the signage. That's what it really boils down to at this point. And like I said, this was passed with a positive recommendation. And as you said, we're changing Exhibit A, did you say, Mayor?
Yes, Exhibit A, just with the slight wordage change.
Okay. Do we have to amend that one too?
I'll defer to Norm. I don't believe so because it didn't change anything within the language of the resolution.
No, I don't believe so.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dan Hoffman, for being here tonight.
Okay. Glad to be invited to join.
Did you have anything to add, Mr. Hoffman? I didn't even ask that.
Well, I would just say that there's 5 signs really that are part of the scope of what we're requesting. Of course, 2 are being removed because it's no longer appropriate to provide direction to Divine Providence Hospital, since it's really not a hospital any longer. The other 3 are basically name changes, as the mayor has shared. And really, what's precipitated this is the Craft Gateway Center project completed by the Lycoming College, that currently they have directional signs, have them exiting onto Market Street, but they have a separate project underway to change their exiting signage to provide direction to exit off of Basin Street. That gives us opportunity to add our name to the supplemental sign to have westbound traffic exit onto Market Street instead of having to go all the way to Maynard Street.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Hoffman. I think we're finished here, Mr. President.
Are there any other comments from council people? Hearing none, then we are finished here. Good job, Councilwoman Katz. And thank you, Mr. Hoffman.
Welcome.
We appreciate our our good relationship with UPMC and the cooperation that we have, cross cooperation together. So we'll have the vote, please, Mrs. Frank.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
yes,
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes 6-0. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. We'll move down to item 6. Would you read that in short form, please, Mrs. Frank?
A resolution appointment for Director of Public Works, and his name is Scott Livermore.
Yes, thank you. Is there a motion and a second?
So move.
second,
Moved and seconded. Welcome, Mayor Slaughter, and welcome, Mr. Livermore.
Yes, good evening again, President Allison, Council, and the administration. Yes, this is an appointment as Director of Public Works. As City Council is aware, we've been attempting to fill this position for quite a while now. And for one reason or another, individuals that were not able to accept the position. So we are very fortunate tonight to have Scott Livermore with us. He has generously and graciously accepted the position as Director of Public Works. Scott comes to us with significant background experience related to the Director of Public Works position. We're very happy to have him here join the city. The salary is at $72,000. At Finance, we did discuss that because that is slightly more than what was budgeted in the salary line item. But with Mr. Winder, obviously pulling dual duties for the last year and a half or so, there was money left in there for the remainder of this year to cover the increased rate. And we discussed at Finance during budget sessions, then the increased rate for 2022. So the remainder of 2021, there's money in there to cover his salary. We also discussed at Finance for the first, until he gets his feet wet, Mr. Livermore working and reporting to Mr. Winder, but eventually, obviously, he's a director and will, sorry, somebody's getting feedback.
Oh, that might have been me. Sorry. I just realized I'm not muted. My bad.
Okay, no, you're good. And then after that, Mr. Winder or Mr. Livermore clearly will be a director and no longer. But having Mr. Winder come from General Manager of Streets and Parks, Public Works, we felt that it does make sense there. This was forwarded to the full body of council with a positive recommendation, and this was reviewed by Mr. White, Solicitor White.
Thank you, Mayor Slaughter. Mr. Livermore, would you care to say anything tonight?
Yes, I just want to say hello to everyone. Thank you, Mayor, for the introduction. Yeah, just, excited about the position and, work with Adam there real closely to get a good transition over into the job. I come with 20 years of construction experience, a lot of heavy highway work, civil earthworks, scheduling, budgeting. Real excited to have the opportunity to work for the city, and I do live in the city limits, so real excited about it.
Well, we're excited as well, Mr. Livermore. It's been a long haul, and I know from several conversations with the mayor, the ups and downs of trying to get this filled, but we're thankful we have that now. This was reviewed in Finance, correct?
Yeah, I'll take this one.
Okay.
Yeah, this was reviewed in Finance, and as the mayor said, was forwarded to the full body with a positive recommendation. The mayor summed this up pretty nicely. There were a few specific items related to this that we did discuss. This is more than budgeted, 12,000, I believe, to be precise. There is enough money in there to still come in under budget based on how the year has played out with that position not being filled. And the mayor is acutely aware of finding the money to support that salary in next year's budget from somewhere else that was specifically discussed. the item of reporting to Mr. Winder at RVT was also discussed. In general, filling this position is a really good thing. You know, when we look at the RVT audit that we had a vigorous discussion about on Tuesday and was presented tonight, you know, one of the mechanisms that has been brought forward and discussed is, you know, previous leadership serving in multiple capacities. We've unfortunately done that up until this point, I think predominantly by need. This gets us away from that practice, which I think we all have wanted for a while, and it's very good to see. You know, as the mayor had said, the other thing we did discuss was this individual reporting to Mr. Winder for a short-term basis. We discussed that specifically. I think we all had a little bit different varying opinions of that. For me personally, I would not like to see that, even if it's just a temporary basis. I think that it lends itself to what's happened in the past, and even if it's a temporary basis, I think it would be a better practice for all of us if that did not happen. I think that educational aspect can happen as colleagues rather than as a direct reporting. I would formally ask the administration to follow that approach versus him directly reporting to Mr. Winder. That's also in compliance with the law that we updated and passed last year. But aside from that, this is good to see. So, and it was again forwarded to the full body of council with a positive recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Yoder. Other comments? Mrs. Katz?
Yes, I'll take up where Liz asked a question and stated that she was hoping that Scott Livermore would get up to speed with what's going on in the parks. This is an area that I know is probably going to be very new to you, Mr. Livermore. And we have wintertime coming, so the parks aren't going to be that viable right now. But come March and April, when things start getting into full force here, I think you're going to get a lot of things, you know, under your belt when it comes to that. I've already set Dave Columbine on you with some roads that I had questions for Dave Columbine this morning. So he's looking forward to getting in touch with you and having contact with you. But welcome aboard. I'm very happy. I've been pushing for this position for a long time. I also have to say I'm very happy that you're living in the city. That was another requirement, and very pleased. As we've all stated, you know, the salary itself, it gets kind of scary when we realize, you know, what we have to attain for the next umpteen years at this point. Once you state a salary, it's there, and we have to make sure that our city grows in order to maintain some of these salaries that we're paying. So I think it's up to the administration to start looking to see where we can start building more income to start covering some more of these expenses. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Katz. Mr. Banks?
Well, first and foremost, I just want to say welcome aboard, Mr. Livermore. It's good to have this position filled. One thing that hasn't been hit on is this is a pretty multifaceted position. You know, you have streets, parks, and flood control. So there's going to be a steep learning curve in the beginning, but I'm sure Mr. Winder will bring you up to speed. So welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Other comments or questions from council? I don't see or hear any. Yeah, as far as the parks aspect, we do have a certified arborist in the fold at Streets and Parks that I think is going to be a great source to rely on. And just a thought, Penn College has a lot of forestry and those kinds of things. You know, perhaps we could, if needed, we could tap into some of their resources to help in the transition if needed in those areas.
Yes, yeah, that was discussed on Tuesday night's financial meeting. That was brought up that wasn't going to be a potential option. Yeah.
Good. Okay, then we'll have the vote then, please, Mrs. Frank.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
yes,
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes 6-0. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Thank you, Mayor Slaughter, and thank you, Mr. Livermore, and welcome aboard to the city of Williamsport. Okay, let's move to the next two items. We're going to table, correct, Mayor?
Yes, that is correct.
So item 7. Would you read that in short form, please, Mrs. Frank?
Resolution awarding the City of Williamsport Bureau of Police Service firearms and related equipment to Whitmore.
Okay.
Am I on the wrong one?
The agenda I have still had 7 and 8 on it, or it still had. Was there an updated agenda that didn't have?
I thought that we were tabling the Dodge Durangos and the,
We took out the transfer ordinance but other council members, what does your item 7 say?
So I'm working off of the agenda that Janice had sent out, I believe, yesterday morning. My item 7 is a resolution authorizing equipment and upfitting cost for 4 2020-21 Dodge
Right.
Durango marked police vehicles. And item number 8 is the purchase of 4
Yeah.
vehicles. And that was from the resolution that was, or the agenda that was sent out after finance.
And I believe the mayor sent an updated one that had those on as well. So does everybody else have that same thing?
I didn't send any agendas.
No.
Just
After the Public Works, after you approve Mr. Scott Livermore, this is Joe Girardi. The one I have is awarding the City of Williamsport Bureau of Police Service firearms and related equipment to
Well, nobody on
safety
council got that agenda.
that's what I have after that one. So I just want to let everybody know I don't have the other two on this agenda.
Everybody on council has a different agenda.
Mine was sent out Thursday, October 21st.
Well, maybe Randy, if it's on there, I'll defer to Norm, but maybe we could just table it via
Yeah.
a vote.
Should we do that, Norm? Can you unmute Mr.?
You might, yeah, you might as well just table it then
Okay,
if you're not prepared to go forward with it.
we're not, and all council has that, so. Item 7, I'll entertain a motion to table.
I make a motion to table. And item 7 is the resolution authorizing equipment and upfitting costs for 4 2021 Dodge Durango marked police vehicles.
That's correct.
I'll second that.
There's a motion and a second to table.
For public record, for items 7 and 8, I know the mayor declared a state of emergency for emergency procurement. It might be a good idea to explain why we're tabling these so that the public is fully aware.
Yes, Mayor Slaughter.
Sure. So what we had was over the past several weeks, month or so, a number of our patrol vehicles went down. Public Works, the Streets and Parks, they've been doing a fantastic job of fixing them. But unfortunately, those patrol vehicles are just at end of life and just can no longer be on the road. So therefore, we don't have, as we've discussed in council meetings and finance committee meetings for a while now, we're exploring various lease options with Enterprise. But due to supply chain issues, we're about 6 to 12 months or more out with being able to procure those vehicles. So working with both Chief Snyder, Assistant Chief Bolt, and Austin White, our solicitor, to procure these vehicles, what we needed to do was declare that emergency proclamation specifically related to the vehicles. And we did a nationwide search for vehicles. And there currently are 4 vehicles right now that are available for us to purchase. We were trying to skip Mimi and Chelsea Blair from our Department of Community Economic Development here in the city. We were hopeful that CDBG funds could be used. And initially, the way we read that, we thought it could be because we were trying to do this emergency purchase. However, there were some conflicting reports, and so we are not comfortable at this time using CDBG funds. So they're looking into that matter further, as the administration is also exploring financials to see if there are other areas where we have saved over the past year to be able to procure these vehicles. But the emergency proclamation was specifically related to vehicles and nothing else. So there's no other state of emergency, just the vehicles. And what that allows us to do, the administration and city council, is to forego the required government bidding since we do not have the time, the 6 to 12 months plus, to wait on these vehicles because we have to provide this service to the public. And that was via recommendation by Solicitor White to do that because obviously we cannot have our police walking to respond to calls if it's an emergency nature. So that's the emergency proclamation. And at this point, as I said, to table, hopefully in the very near future, hopefully by the next in 2 weeks, if not before, we will have a few solutions to council where we can procure these vehicles.
Thank you, Mayor Slaughter. With no other comments or questions, Mr. Mackey.
Thank you, President Allison. Sorry, just when I was listening to the mayor explain that, Mayor, you said we went on a national search for these vehicles, and the way you made it sound, were these the only 4 vehicles we found?
That is correct. I'll defer to Chief Snyder, but yes, they called all over the place for police rated vehicles. And these are the only 4, and they're currently being held for us right now.
That was good.
So, yeah.
That was
So
gonna
they're
be my
holding
next
them.
question.
Yes. So they are holding them for us. That's why we are obviously working extremely quickly and diligently to find the money to procure this, to see where we have saved. So Mr. Pavlak, myself, Chief Snyder, Assist Chief Bolt have been working, very hard so that these vehicles don't go elsewhere. Because obviously I'm sure, are not the only police department in the situation right now, as vehicles are in short supply, regular vehicles and police vehicles. So, we want to, the dealership is aware that we want them and we want them now. So yes, hopefully very soon here, we can get that in front of council.
Okay, great.
Other questions? Okay, we'll have the vote on the motion to table, please, Mrs. Frank.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
Are you muted, Bonnie?
Mrs. Katz,
It wouldn't unmute. I'm sorry. Yes.
Mr. Beggs,
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes 6-0. Let's move to item 8. Would you read that in short form, please, Mrs. Frank?
Resolution authorizing the purchase of 4 pursuit rated marked vehicles from the Cincinnati Chrysler Complex, or Cincinnati, I don't know.
Yeah, that's close enough. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. This is directly related to the first. So I'll entertain a motion to table.
I make a motion to table.
I'll second.
Motion and a second to table. Any further discussion on this subject? I think we covered everything. Mrs. Frank, on the motion to table, please.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
yes,
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes 6-0. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Okay, we'll move to item 9. Would you read that in short form, please, Mrs. Frank?
I have resolution awarding the City of Williamsport Bureau of Police Service firearms and related equipment to Whitmore Public Safety Group and Atlantic Technical Incorporation.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Is there a motion and a second from council?
So
So
move.
move.
second,
There's a motion and a second. Welcome, Chief Snyder.
Thanks, sir. Good evening, President Allison and members of council. The Williamsport Bureau of Police issued an invitation for bid to procure service handguns and related equipment. The bid was open from August 30th, 2021 until the closing on September 28th of 2021. Result of those bids were that Whitmer Public Safety Group Incorporated was the lowest responsive bidder for the service handguns. Their base low bid was at $6,545 after trade-in. The initial cost of the firearms were $23,870 before trade-in. Trade-in value was $17,325, with the difference, as I said, $6,545 would be the cost for the firearms. Then for equipment, related to handgun equipment, Atlantic Tactical Incorporated was the lowest responsive bidder. Their base low bid was for $11,467.50. There's 3 items of equipment that we were looking for. One was the tactical light. The cost that they projected for that was $4,299.90. For the holster, $5,854.75. And then for the magazine pouches, they were listed at $1,312.85 for a total of $11,467.50. That would put the total cost at $18,012.50 for both the firearms and the related equipment. These bids were read publicly on October 5th in front of Williamsport City Finance Committee, and the bids were provided to the city solicitor, Mr. Austin White, for review, and he found them to be compliant with all the requirements contained in the ITB. So I'll open the floor for any questions.
Thank you, Chief Snyder.
Yes, sir.
Reviewed in kind, finance. Mrs. Katz.
yes, it was. It was reviewed in finance. This bid is for 55 guns. And number one, it's under budget. Number two, this has been a line item for a couple of years. This is something the police department has needed for a long time. They also received good pricing on this, and the trade-in was a good price. So, but again, like I said, this is under budget, and this was passed a full body of council with a positive recommendation.
Thank you, Mrs. Katz. Other members of council? Yeah, pretty straightforward. So we'll have the vote then, please, Mrs. Frank.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
Yes,
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes 6-0. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. And thank you, Chief Snyder.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
We'll move on to the next item, item 10 on our agenda. Would you read that resolution authorizing excavation, please, Mrs. Frank, in short form?
Resolution authorizing the excavation of certain streets for a gas main replacement project by the City of Winsburg for UGI Utilities, and this first one was for Lafayette.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Is there a motion and a second from council?
So move.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Welcome, Mr. Girardi.
Yes, good evening, President Allison, members of council. What you had before you are basically 3 resolutions. The first, and the reason why you have 3 is each project's a little bit different due to the length of the project and timeframes and so forth. So I bring you 3 resolutions. The first one is for the Lafayette Parkway project. which is basically a joint project between Lowestoft and Williamsport. Some of the lines that they did were in Lowestoft, some are in Williamsport. They'll have base repair done, which we require before asphalt plants close. They won't have any milling and overlaying done. They're requesting to extend that till spring, and then 45 days after that, it must be done. Typical resolution that we do at this time of the year. There's several projects. Williamsport Water Authority has them sometimes. UGI has them sometimes. It gives us a better product overall.
Mhm.
And I have any questions for anyone, or any answers for anybody has any questions?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Girardi. I believe this was in Public Works, correct?
Yes, it was.
Yes, it was. It did come to Public Works. I think Mr. Girardi explained this thoroughly. It's something that does come to us every year at this time of the year. And this was passed on to the full body of council with a positive recommendation.
Thank you, Mrs. Katz. Questions from council members? Hearing or seeing none, we'll have the vote. Mrs. Frank, please.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
Yes.
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes 6-0. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. We'll move to item 11. Would you read that in short form, please, Mrs. Frank?
Resolution authorizing the excavation of certain streets for a gas main replacement project by the city of Williamsport for UGI Utilities. And this one is for the Tucker Street project.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Motion and a second from council.
So
moved.
move. Second.
And Mr. Girardi, as you said, this is a continuation of.
Correct. This would be the Tucker Street project. I attached a map because it's a rather large project. They'll have all the base repairs done prior to the plant closing. And then at that point, when spring starts, they'll have 45 days to complete the project. Have any questions? More than happy to answer.
These are all in Public Works, so.
Yes, all three of these went through Public Works with a
Yes.
positive recommendation.
Anything more to add, Mrs. Katz?
Not at all. Mr. Girardi said it all.
Yes. I see nothing from other council members. Mrs. Frank, on the motion, please.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
Yes.
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes 6-0. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. And we'll move to item 12. Would you read that, please, Mrs. Frank?
Resolution authorizing the excavation of certain streets for a gas main replacement project by the city of Williamsport for UGI Utilities. And this one's for the Park Avenue project.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Motion and second, please.
So moved.
So move.
Second.
Thank you. There it is. And Mr. Girardi, same thing. And
The only thing I would add is this is called the Park Avenue project. It starts up by the pajama factory and runs east down to 3rd Avenue. Probably about 2 years ago from 3rd Avenue to Hebron Street, same thing occurred. The gas
Right.
company went in and did the same thing. So
Mhm.
basically from Park Avenue, or not from Park Avenue, excuse me, from the pajama factory down to Hebron Street, we have a brand new road on both sides.
Yeah, that's a pretty
But
long.
this would be another extension of time.
Pretty long stretch there.
Yes,
Quite an extensive project. And they did a little bit of side work off those.
correct. Usually they do side work if there's a gas main going up. I think it goes also from Park Avenue on Rose out to close to 3rd,
Mhm.
the extension down that end.
That's
Yep,
where they.
so
were
there's
now.
offshoots. Yep.
Mrs. Katz, anything more to add?
No, I think he covered it.
Okay, thank you. We'll have the vote then, Mrs. Frank.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
Yes.
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes 6-0. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. And thank
If
you.
I can
Mr.
just add one thing, where
Yes.
we're on Public Works last year, we go through a lot of these. One of the projects, Mr. Yoder, I think it's right in front of your house that came down through was a gas project that started in spring and it ended in before the plants closed this year. Sometimes they do get in depending on when they start. Project up by my house, it was Lundy Drive and so forth up through that area. They started that in fall asked for an extension of time. It's now been milled and overlaid. So we get a good product. Sometimes these things take about a year and 2 months, but the end result is it's a really, really nice project. And everybody should like the roads when they're done.
Yeah. And we did quite a few alleys this year.
Correct.
I've talked to different residents who are pretty happy about what's been done.
And Adam Winder and of course, Mr. Livermore will be doing it. They work in conjunction. So does John Sanders with the authorities and so forth. Because sometimes when these projects carry over to spring, it gets put on our milling project where it's a combination of us doing a half a street, them doing a half a street. And overall, it costs the residents, taxpayers, and even UGI individuals who pay for gas less money.
Right.
So it works out overall very well.
Yes. Okay, let's move on to item 13. Would you read that in short form, please, Mrs. Frank?
Resolution authorizing a subcontract agreement between the City of Williamsport, Bureau of Transportation, and Crawford Area Transportation Authority.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Is there a motion second from council?
So move.
Second.
Mr. Winder, welcome.
Good evening. Mr. Allison, if you don't mind, I'm going to tie the two of these together because it's kind of going backwards.
Okay.
Endless Mountain Transportation put out an RFP for management services per PennDOT's requirement. As many of you are aware, River Valley Transit has been managing Endless Mountain Transportation since 2011. This management agreement and agreement with Crawford Area Transportation Authority would both be two-year agreements with 3 one-year renewals. The dynamics of it is that Crawford Area Transportation Authority brings some great abilities to the management team with legislative avenues, also the experience with shared ride. It kind of complements the River Valley Transit team very well when it comes to Endless Mountain Transportation. We all work well together. River Valley Transit was scored the highest by other transit agencies for this proposal with Endless Mountain Transportation. The agreement between River Valley Transit and Crawford Area Transportation Authority would be for an annual amount of $20,800, which would be reimbursed by Endless Mountain Transportation. The agreement with Endless Mountain Transportation would be for $213,100 annually. And it is a great working relationship with all three entities. We will answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Winder. This was reviewed in finance, Mrs. Katz.
Yes, it was reviewed in finance.
Both
I
of
think
them.
we're all very pleased with what's going on with Endless Mountains and the Crawford Area Transportation. As we all know, we've heard for so many years that regionalization is the way to go. And this has been working out now for, I don't remember, Adam, how many years now with Endless Mountains. It's at least
10
4 or 5.
10 years.
That's 10 years. Oh my goodness, time flies by. And it's been working out beautifully. And to have the contract again, I think is good. We talked at finance as far as expanding maybe other areas for regionalization. And other than that, I don't have anything else to say. This was passed with a positive recommendation on both the resolutions.
Thank you, Mrs. Katz. Other comments or questions?
Just to clarify, I think these were forwarded with no recommendation. We had some questions.
Mhm.
That's okay. Sorry. We had some questions surrounding some past questions that we've had, and then given the the audit report, what have you, we wanted to have a discussion in the broader group of council But I, with Councilwoman Katz's points are very accurate. When we're talking regionalization, which is really the future of transit, both of these position us very well to lead that effort regionally. And these are both generally good things that I hope we all do support. I believe a lot of the questions that we have had in the past have been addressed and are no longer happening. And so I think we're in a good spot.
Great. I agree. Other comments from council members? Okay. Hearing none, Mrs. Frank on the motion, please.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
Yes.
Mr. Banks.
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes 6-0. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Let's move to item 14. Would you read that in short form, please?
Resolution authorizing an agreement between the City of Williamsport, Bureau of Transportation, and Endless Mountains Transportation Authority.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Is there a motion and second?
So moved.
Second.
And moved and seconded. Thank you. Mr. Winder, the other half of this.
I think I summed it all up.
Yeah.
I did include in your packet what the oversight as far as management, or what the criteria is for the management services with Endless Mountain Transportation. But other than that, we'll entertain any questions you may have.
And this was reviewed in finance as well as part of that package.
Yes, and this was, as Mr. Yoder pointed out, we passed this on with no recommendation to get some questions answered. And I think we did get some of these questions answered.
Right. Other comments from council? I agree there were certainly circumstances, and we certainly heard some tonight in that audit. But the concept is valid and the concept is very good. So you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You get rid of the dirty water and clean the baby up, and you're ready to go. And I think that process is now underway. We just need to be diligent about pursuing it. Okay, Mrs. Frank on the motion, please.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
Yes.
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes 6-0. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. And we will move to item 15. Would you read that in short form, please?
Resolution Consolidated Capital Grant Application Resolution to file application and to certify local match.
A motion and second, please.
So move.
Second.
Thank you. And Mr. Winder.
This is a consolidated capital grant application, resolution to file application and to certify local match. This is an annual resolution that comes before you for the Williamsport Bureau of Transportation. The overall capital grant would be $1,673,480 with 1514 state discretionary trust funds. That would require a $55,770 match. It does replace quite a few items, which I have attached to summary. I could certainly run through them if you'd like, or I can just sum them up real quick.
Yeah.
Okay. It would be IT equipment, roof coating on the facility here at 1500 West 3rd Street, garage door replacement, and support vehicle replacement, pickup trucks, a all-inclusive service truck for the maintenance department to go out and hopefully repair buses on the road versus having them towed. All these items are part of our CPT program. And basically the state says that they've met their useful life, so the state's willing to replace them with a small match from the transportation department. We do have the $55,770 for the match in the capital grant local match account. This was reviewed by finance and passed forward with a positive recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Winder. Mrs. Katz, Finance.
I think she might have stepped away. I'll take it quick. Yeah, this was reviewed in finance and I believe was forward with a full to the full body of council with a positive recommendation. We really didn't have much discussion surrounding this one. As we've noted, we see this every year. This is a standard operating thing within RVT. So nothing super crazy here. Mr. Winder, kind of gave a good overview. One point of clarification. I don't recall discussing this in finance, and it came to me here after the second review of the audit. I know that was one thing that was captured in the audit, was that this procedure was not carried out properly before. Did we use the proper procedure to put this one together and go out, or will that take effect on the next one?
This one, we used the proper procedure. We were, how do I say it, heavily looked at for our capital grants project this year due to things that were noted in the budget. We did have a discussion with Mr. Levitsky from PennDOT prior to them essentially saying they were going to approve it. We had to give definitive clarification of exactly what we were doing, what the needs were, etc. So this was done 100% properly.
Perfect. That's good to hear. If you'd be so kind as to send that over after the fact, I'd be curious to see what all that looks like as far as the documentation you had to provide and what have you, just for my own educational purposes. But that's good to hear, and I figured as much, but just wanted to clarify. So I'll yield the floor to other members of council.
Absolutely, thank you.
Other questions or comments on this from council members? Okay, hearing none, seeing none. Mrs. Frank on the motion, please.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
Yes.
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes 6-0. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Thank you, Mr. Winder. Okay, that does the resolution and everything else. That section, we'll move on to item 17. Except for filing, Finance Committee meeting minutes of 9/7/21, Williamsport Water and Sanitary Authority minutes of August 25th, 21, and second quarter financial report. Is there a motion and a second?
So moved.
Second.
Are there any questions or corrections from council members on those minutes? Hearing and seeing none, Mrs. Frank on the motion, please.
Mr. Yoder,
Yes.
Mr. Mackey,
Yes.
Mr. Pelisi,
Yes.
Mrs. Katz,
Yes.
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Mr. Allison.
Yes, motion passes 6-0. Our announcements, our next scheduled city council meeting will be on Thursday, November 4th, 2021 at 7 p.m. Meeting remotely. Upcoming meetings, there's no ERC meeting this week. Wednesday, October 27th at 11:30 a.m. Redevelopment Authority. Monday, November 1st, 12 p.m. Planning Commission. Tuesday, November 2nd, 11:30 a.m. Public Safety. 1 p.m. Finance, 2:30 p.m. Public Works. And then we're back to our regular council meeting. Are there any comments from council members tonight? Mr. Mackey?
Quick question, President Allison. I was unable to attend the last ARPA meeting that we had with concerning the ARPA funds.
Yeah.
Has there been another one of those scheduled?
We have not scheduled that, so we need to do that for November.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious.
That's at the top of the list to move into now. Other comments from council members? Anything from the administration tonight? Anything from the public, Mr. Lubin?
I didn't receive anything.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lubin. We are working on another format to access public comments. This is a little clunky, this one. Hopefully sooner rather than later, we can get back to in-person meetings. I think we need to have that discussion when that would be appropriate with budget